Welcome everyone to the APH Virtual Excel Academy. We are here today to talk about using blocker cars. I am so glad to have you join us today. Again, this is the APH Virtual Excel Academy, and today we're talking about using blocker cars. Today is a Wednesday, and this means that we're aiming to talk to you who are in your upper stage of middle school, high school, and maybe you're even starting college. This really is for you, but everybody is welcome, no matter where you are. But realize we are talking about a pretty detailed concept, so it might be new to you. Welcome to the APH Virtual Excel Academy. Today is using blocker cars. We have a special instructor for you today. His name is Jay Whipple. Jay, I am turning it over to you.
Thank you so much. I am going to share my screen, hopefully. And get that to...
There you go. And now I'll turn on PowerPoint. There you go.
Okay. Here we are. So yeah, my name is Jay Whipple. I am the itinerant division manager for an organization called the Foundation for Blind Children. We are in Phoenix, Arizona. We serve a very large group of students in school districts and public schools, and we have a wide variety of students, but it is pretty much in the Phoenix area. So for those of you who live in very cold places, you're going to get to see a couple of pictures of what winter looks like in Phoenix. So hopefully you enjoy that. We'll start right here. Welcome. We're going to talk about blocker cars today, and I wanted to kind of start out with a picture just to give you an idea of what a blocker car is. I want to move myself down here. And if you can see in this picture, I have a photo of that I actually took. This was yesterday, in fact. And you see a white Toyota that's coming along in the closest parallel lane. It's approaching us from in front of us because in this picture, I'm aligned clockwise to this crossing. I'll talk a little bit later about the differences between clockwise and counterclockwise. But what I wanted you to see is that this blocker car is in the very closest lane, and it's right at the corner of the sidewalk. And that's the point when you are certain that that car is driving through, is not making a turn or slowing down to a stop. Then you can time your crossing to start. Let me see here. So today's objective. We're going to talk about what are blocker cars, where do you use blocker cars, how do you use blocker cars. And I will say this is a pretty advanced skill. Not every student's going to learn how to do it perfectly. Some students learn it really well in a counterclockwise orientation, but not so much in a clockwise orientation. Some people learn it really well, no matter where they're standing. That's okay. We're going to talk about a lot of foundational skills and prerequisite skills that come into play when you try to do this. And so I think there'll be a little bit something for everyone, even if you're not ready to start using blocker cars today. Disclaimer, I love disclaimers. There's a good chance you'll get another one somewhere in this presentation. I wanted to let you know that this session it's not intended for you to go out and immediately start using blocker cars. I want you to take this information, think about it, discuss it with your O&M specialists, and practice it with them. So don't just go outside to start using them. Safety is always my top concern, and I want you to practice this with your O&M specialist like you would any other skill. So what are blocker cars? Before I answer that, let's talk a little bit about Goalball. So why Goalball, you ask? Partly because I just love Goalball. I think it's just something I really, really enjoy. But Goalball teaches a lot of prerequisite skills that are necessary for using blocker cars. Now I'm going to quickly explain a little bit about Goalball because there might be some of you who have never tried Goalball. If you have, kind of throw that into the chat for me or mention it, and hopefully at least some of you are familiar with Goalball. So Goalball is a sport that was invented for blind athletes, and it's really unique because it is not an adapted sport. Nobody came along and said, let's adapt golf or basketball or football, and those things have been done. But this sport was invented specifically for blind athletes. It's a very fast-paced and exciting game, and it's played at the Paralympic level. And so it's super fun, but it teaches so many skills that are relevant to orientation and mobility. And so I always encourage all of my students, and I would encourage all of you to become active in Goalball in your communities if it's available to you. And research it too. There's all sorts of great stuff on YouTube about Goalball, and you can really learn a lot about it. So some of those prerequisite skills that you learn from Goalball: parallel and perpendicular. Goalball uses tactile markers on the court that help you kind of know where you as your team are placed up, and it really helps you learn those skills of parallel and perpendicular. As you can imagine, those are in any kind of crossing. Knowing where your parallel traffic is versus your perpendicular traffic, and knowing which street is parallel to you and which street is perpendicular to you are absolutely essential before you make any kind of crossing. And then sound localization. So sound localization, if you don't know, is the ability to kind of pick out a sound in your environment and focus on it, and not necessarily focus on the kinds of sounds that aren't as important. Now, Goalball does this in a lot of ways. The ball that you play with in Goalball is it's about the size of a basketball, and it's filled with little bells. So when you roll it, you can hear it move across the court. But you can also practice sound localization by listening for your teammates and listening to the opposite team who are trying to throw the ball at your end, at your goal, and score on you. And of course, when you're out making any kind of street crossing, you're always using sound localization skills. You're listening for your parallel traffic. You're listening for cars that are maybe making a right turn, or perhaps making a left turn, cars that are the parallel surge. There's so much that you need to do. And as most of you probably know, when you're making some kind of a crossing, there's often other noise out there in your environment. It would be very rare and probably kind of weird to be trying to make a crossing and there's nothing but the sound of the traffic. There's no, wind and overhead airplanes and construction or landscapers, the other kinds of things that are present in your environment. So that ability to kind of figure out which sounds are super important and which ones aren't, so that you can use that information to increase your chances of making a safe and successful crossing. So let's see here. As always, if you have questions, please reach them out there. I'm not seeing the chat window, so Robin, perhaps if some comes across, just throw them at me.
Will do.
So now what are blocker cars? Not quite yet. Let's review a few basic processes for crossing streets, because you need those skills in order to use blocker cars. So let's kind of review. I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, have worked on street crossings, either residential street crossings or complex lighted crossings or everything in between. And one of the things I always tell all my students is that there's no way for me to ever go with a student to every street crossing, to every corner they're ever going to have to cross. What I can do, though, is teach you a process that you can use to cross streets. And that process can be applied to anywhere in the world. So what I've put up here in front of you is a really, really rudimentary discussion on that, and I'm going to break it down a little bit as we go. But I also tell my students, you can't cross the street until you get there. So the beginning of the process of crossing streets is your approach and then your alignment. So you have to kind of get to the corner. You have to align yourself to a point where you feel that you are parallel to one street and perpendicular to the other, so that when you step off and you start to cross, you're not veering out into either one of those two streets. Once you do that, there's a process of analyzation and timing. Now, this is where I think the most time is spent in street crossings, because analyzing traffic sounds and patterns and figuring out all the necessary information of a street crossing, that takes time. And it's another one of those skills that you need to practice with your O&M teachers. And you know, some of you may not learn it as well as others, but as you practice, you'll definitely pick it up. I do so many things. I mentioned sound localization. One of the things sometimes I do with my students, it's always a hit and we get a lot of weird looks from drivers, but I sometimes go out to street corners and we sit in little folding chairs and we just sit there on the corner and we start to identify every piece of the traffic cycle, every phase. And we'll talk about how that is my perpendicular through phase, and then that comes to an end, and then the left turning cars go, and then you hear the parallel through phase and so on. And so you're going to spend a lot of time analyzing intersections and analyzing every kind of crossing you ever make. And then the last step of crossing streets is the execution of the crossing. In other words, you're stepping off the sidewalk, you've committed. You're going to walk out into the street and you're going to head across the street. And I think something that sometimes people forget or struggle to remember is that your crossing isn't over until you're all the way across the street. You're constantly listening to that parallel traffic and reminding yourself that that of the goal that you have to get across that street and not veer. And so your crossing ends once you step up on that curb on the other side, and you're safe and happy and on your way. Do I have questions from anyone about that, or comments that you'd like to tell me about your process for when you use streets, when you cross streets?
We do not have any current questions, but Jay's current question is, what tips or processes do you use when you are crossing the street? So we'll give everybody a chance just to answer that quick question.
And I'll give you an example once that one of my students told me, and it's something that he kind of figured out in his process for crossing streets that I've since taught many of my other students. And I was really impressed because this student was like 5th grade, I think, when he told me this, but he used to tell me that sometimes when he would stand on the corner, it was really hard for him to know whether or not the car that was in the right turn only lane was going to kind of come around the corner. And that's a really hard thing to figure out. And he had figured out that he didn't want to try to like wave them on or direct traffic, because he felt like he didn't want them to like pay attention to him and turn into some busy roadway. And so he used to tell me that what he liked to do is that he called it retreating. And he said what he would do is he would take a half a step backwards and he'd put his head down and he'd bring his arm up and act like he was looking at his watch. And he told me, it doesn't even matter that I can't see my watch. The drivers don't know that. But he said, because I put my head down and I back up a half a step, it's like I've removed myself from the equation. And I thought that was really brilliant. And a lot of because your body language in crossings does make a huge difference. Drivers notice that. And they are more likely to respond if you're giving them some sort of nonverbal cue like that. And so if any of you have
we do have a question from Donnie. Sorry to interrupt like that. Donnie wants to know if he can use sighted guide when he crosses the street.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, a little bit later, I'm going to talk about something where I always say there's always an alternative to making an unsafe crossing. We'll get to that. But one of those alternatives is ask for assistance. Use a sighted guide or a human guide, whatever you want to refer to it as. Because what is most important is that you make it across the street safely. Everybody needs a little help sometimes with something. I certainly do all the time. So yeah, that's absolutely a great alternative.
Hey Jay, we have an answer from Nicole for your question about what tips or processes do you use to cross the street. And Nicole says, understand the traffic pattern of the intersection you are at.
Absolutely. And I totally agree. That is part of what I was talking about when you say you analyze those patterns. Sometimes, if it's a street that you cross every day and you on your way to work or on your way to school and you cross it again coming home every day, you don't have to analyze as much and you have a better understanding of that traffic pattern because you do it the same all the time. But, sometimes you also come to streets that you've not been to before, or even crossings that you make frequently, things change. In fact, in the opening photo that I showed, I didn't mention it, but there's some construction that's going on at that particular entry into that little side street. And sometimes construction can just really change everything you know about that intersection, because maybe they've destroyed the curb, or they're digging, and you have to kind of have a little bit of a detour. And so, like you said, being able to stand there and listen and analyze and use all the information that you can. If you've got some low vision that helps you understand the traffic pattern, fantastic. If not, you're doing it auditorily, and that's fine too. So I really love that answer. I like hearing it too, because it tells me you are paying attention when you're making your crossings. So finally, what you've all been waiting for, what are blocker cars? I've got a nice long description here, and I'm going to read through it, and then we'll unpack it a little bit as well. So blocker cars are moving parallel traffic on busy streets that prevent stationary traffic entering the roadway from the perpendicular street or from the parallel street onto the perpendicular street. Blocker cars are also useful when there is a driveway from a parking lot or a shopping center that is perpendicular and must be crossed. So there's a lot to talk about right there, but let's unpack it a little bit. So part of a blocker car is, forgive me, let me start over here. When you're standing there and you're getting ready to cross your perpendicular street, one of the things that happens a lot out here in the Southwest where I live, my city is is designed in such a way that we have very huge shopping centers with grocery stores and hardware stores and things, and lots of other small businesses that surround them. And there's what always appears like an ocean of parking lot between the street and those buildings. And you've got to find your way, across all that to get to the buildings. But when you're just walking along the street, those cars that are trying to exit that shopping center, they're right there in front of you. And it's really difficult sometimes to know, like the example I told you with my student who looks at his watch, is that car going to turn out in front of me? Are they going to make a left or a right turn to get into the traffic of this street? And but the other thing is that it's sometimes hard to know, like, if there are cars that are out in the roadway already that are in the left turn lane, are they going to turn and turn into the parking lot or the small side street that it feeds onto your busy street? And so you have to figure out, like, what can I do to control, to kind of answer those questions and take those variables out of the equation. So blocker cars are one of the strategies that you can do to do that. So let me see here. I also wanted to talk a little bit about what I mean when I say busy streets, because sometimes all streets can sound busy, and I totally get that. So for our discussion, I'm talking about how when you have a big street that has multiple lanes of traffic that tends to be moving pretty fast, and then you have either those parking lot driveways or really small, like, residential streets that are feeding into those really big streets. And where this comes to play is that the cars that are coming from the parking lots or the small streets entering those huge busy streets that are loud and typically have traffic all the time, regardless of what time of day it is, those cars have to yield to the cars that are moving on the big street. And really, a lot of times, the only thing that controls what they do is the presence of traffic or whether or not you decide to step into the street. So let's kind of move on. If you have some questions about blocker cars, ask them, but we're also going to continue to talk a little bit. So where do you use your blocker cars? Side streets and driveways. One of the things I've noticed a lot recently here in the Phoenix area is the traffic engineers are starting to build what they call they're called slip lanes. And it's almost like a little turn lane that's specifically just for traffic that wants to enter into the shopping center. That becomes much more difficult to use a blocker car, and I would use caution about trying to do that there. because the closest parallel lane at that point is a little further away, and they're not actually blocking the cars that are trying to enter or exit from those parking lots. So like I mentioned a second ago, what controls traffic in places where blocker cars can be used? Sometimes it's a stop sign. A lot of times when you have a small residential street or that feeds into those big, huge kind of major streets, those are there's a stop sign there for the car on the small street. And they can go once they've stopped and it's clear and safe for them to enter the roadway. Sometimes there's nothing. In fact, that's more common than not. There's nothing on that street. The only thing that controls what happens there is whether or not that driver feels like it's safe for them to turn into the oncoming traffic. And of course, your presence. If you've decided to step off the curb and will start to walk along and make that crossing, then of course they're not allowed to run over you. I will tell you though, drivers sometimes do some really weird things. They get distracted. They look at their phones. Sometimes cars that are about to try to make a right turn, that are going to cross over in front of you and make a right turn in, they're not looking at you. They're looking to the left to see if any oncoming traffic is coming. So your ability to kind of get their attention and understand and let them know that you're there is really important. Let's see. All right, we're going to start here. I've got a little video and I want to kind of describe a little bit about what this is, because this is a video where I've got a shopping center. There's a big supermarket there's a pickup truck that's waiting to leave that shopping center parking lot. And there you're going to see a car coming along from in front of you that's going to be in the very first lane. And that as that car drives by, you'll see that it prevents this car from turning out onto the roadway. Now, this driver was wanting to make a right turn onto the roadway, and you'll see him then make the right turn after the blocker car goes by. Let me see if my video is going to work. I'm going to play that one more time for you because it's so quick.
And Jay, can you just give a quick description of what happens on your next video?
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
Can you give a quick description of what's happening, just for any of the kiddos with no vision?
Yes, in this video?
Yes, please.
Like I said, so what this is this is actually me standing at a driveway to a big shopping center. There's a small pickup truck that's waiting in the parking lot of the shopping center to turn out into the roadway. And when he turns, he's going to make a right turn and cross directly in front of me. Now there's an oncoming car from directly in front of me in the parallel lane to my right, who's driving along, and that car prevents the pickup truck from making the right turn into the road. Because if they do, there's going to be an accident and they're going to crash into each other. And so you'll kind of see as you approach, the car kind of goes by, then the truck is allowed to kind of go out into the roadway because that blocker car has passed. What's amazing though is that you can time your crossing so that when that blocker car is going by and he can't turn out there, you can start your crossing because that blocker car kind of makes it safer for you. It prevents him from having that ability to do that. Does anybody want to see that video one more time? We can certainly do that if you'd like. I'll go ahead and do it just in case. I like it also if you listen to the sound in this video, cars that are moving really fast make a much different sound than cars that are slowing down or cars that are starting to accelerate. In fact, I'll play the video another time, and I'm going to say now when you would begin your crossing. But I want you to listen to the sound of the car. Not only the pickup truck that stopped, which is kind of can be the second car that you hear. It's going to make a much different sound. It almost has a little bit of a squeak as it goes around the corner. But the oncoming car, you'll hear that car that's moving at roughly 40 miles an hour when it has a sort of constant, steady sound. Oh, shoot. Just a minute. And right there at the end, I can hear a little bit of a squeak as he starts to accelerate. All right, we're going to move on to our next slide. So let's review a little bit. And you can kind of put your answers into the chat here. You can say them to yourself, but think about it. But what are some of the prerequisite skills that needed to use blocker cars? Yeah. Any answers from anyone?
We'll give everybody a second. Drop in the chat window. What are some things that you think you need to know if you want to start using the blocker car technique?
And I'll begin to start. Part of it is basic street crossing processes, right? We talked a little bit about how your approach, and then your alignment, then you analyze and time your crossing, and then you execute the crossing. Really, if you don't have those prerequisite skills, I don't want you to try to use these blocker cars. It's just not, you're just not ready for it yet. And that's okay. Everybody has their process, and you're all you're all learning. That's why you're here today. And so I want you to build up to this process. We talked about parallel and perpendicular. Those are really fundamental skills. In fact, parallel and perpendicular that's a skill that I begin working on with preschoolers. As soon as I get a student, we start to work on that concept of what is parallel and what is perpendicular, and what it really means, because cementing that concept of noise is going to serve you and serve students throughout your lives. So it's a really good foundational skill to be working on that can get you to a point to get you more ready to be able to use these blocker cars as you are doing more advanced travel. And then sound localization. I've talked a lot about that. You remember Goalball and some of the ways you can do it there. Some of the things that I work on with sound localization too, and you can do this with your O&M teacher as well, is you can use, there are a variety of sound sources. I know APH makes one, but you can use almost anything. I actually put a little bicycle bell on my cane, and I use that because it's so much easier to carry around. And if I like to go into like a multi-purpose room with a student when there's no one else there, and I like to be able to ring that bell and have my student kind of walk to that bell and point to that sound and be able to use any kind of sound source you want. And then you can start to add in other sounds. Maybe it is like I'll sometimes open the door and you can hear the sound of the playground, or maybe I turn on music on my phone and then we use that bell, and you have to kind of localize that sound when there are other competing sounds. There's a lot of ways that you can practice this, and it's always a good thing to do. I feel like sound localization is also a skill that, like many things in O&M, if you don't use it, you'll lose it. You have to practice using these things. That's something I learned when I was learning foreign language as well. Like some things require a constant upkeep in order to kind of maintain that fluency and that comfortable ability to use them.
Hey, Jay, we do have some answers coming through to your original questions about what prerequisite skills do you need. So Nicole says being able to identify oncoming traffic and know what a blocker car is. Riley says you need to know where the blocker car is coming from. Connor comments, I think I need more basic practice with street crossing. And then Claire's asked a question. Can you speak about the process of timing?
Yes. So let me I'm actually going to get to the timing portion in a bit. I love hearing you say that you think you need some more basic street crossing skills. Like, that's fantastic. Like, I think realizing like what your strengths and weaknesses are is the best way to improve your skills. So that's really good. I love hearing that. You're absolutely right in terms of kind of knowing where the blocker cars are coming from. That's something else that I'm gonna talk about in a minute, because it does matter how you're aligned to that crossing. So yes, I am definitely going to talk about how you time that crossing. And then where do you use blocker cars? Side streets, driveways. Not a lot of other places that you'll use them. I was trying to think about like any other environments I've ever tried to have someone use a blocker car, and I really didn't really find any. But if some of you can think of them, I'd love to hear them, because I'm not always right and I don't know everything. Whoops, went too far. So how do we use blocker cars? Okay, before I discuss that, another disclaimer. I told you I like disclaimers. Move myself here a little bit. There's always an alternative to making unsafe crossing. I said that once already, and I'll say it a lot. I say it to my students all the time. Do not make a crossing if you don't feel safe doing it. It's not worth it. But sometimes the alternatives, it can be hard to think of those alternatives. And this is a place where, as I talk, if any of you have some thoughts about alternatives to making an unsafe crossing, put them out there in the chat. This is a really good discussion. Some of the ways that I talk about, and one of them was something somebody already hinted at, which was using a sighted guide or asking for assistance. Like, that's a really easy one. And in some environments, I know it's much easier to ask for assistance than in others. In the Phoenix area where I live, we are not a predominantly pedestrian-friendly city. Not a lot of people walk all over the place. We're very spread out, and you have to walk a long way to get from one place to another. And it's also unbelievably hot here for more than half the year. And so you don't get a lot of people walking around. Now, in places like Manhattan or Chicago, when I've worked there or visited there, very, very pedestrian friendly. Lots and lots of people out and around, and it can be easier to ask for assistance. Another alternative to making an unsafe crossing is cross somewhere else. It could be that the crossing you're trying to make is complicated because of some sort of masking sounds or background noises, or there's construction like we talked about. It could be lots of reasons. But if you go one block east or west or north or south of where you are, you might be able to cross there, where it's a much simpler crossing, and just come back a block, which doesn't always sound like the most appealing, I know, because you're going to walk a little bit more. But if it makes you safer, it's worth your time. One of the phrases I always say to my students is, "It's better late than dead," and because it's just the truth. And anywhere you're going and anyone that you're trying to get to, if they don't understand that, they're not worth going to anyway. And I really, yes.
We have two comments about alternatives that agree with you. So first, Connor already says in the chat, I agree with you. It's better to wait longer. And then Nicole shares, one alternative may be cutting through the grass.
Oh, I'd love to hear more about that, because I'm not sure exactly what you mean by cutting through the grass. And I'll give you a second to kind of formulate that.
I'll say, Nicole, go ahead. And if you'd like to raise your digital hand, we can unmute you. You can keep your camera off, but you can talk to Jay and explain what you mean, and to everybody else, about cutting through the grass. So I am looking for you right now, Nicole.
I will also say that while we're waiting for Nicole, another alternative is to not cross at all. Maybe you just don't do it that day. You find some other method. I've even had students who will ride the city bus through an intersection and get off and walk back, because it's easier than trying to make that crossing. So sometimes it's simple as just going one stop further on that bus than you thought, and that way it gets you through the road and you don't have to cross.
All right, Nicole is ready. Go ahead and unmute Nicole and talk with Jay.
So I'm actually here with Casey, and he was the one who said it. We're just using my computer, so I'm going to let him go.
Okay, so what I mean when I say cutting through the grass, I'm like saying like, what if you don't know where per se, like where the a sidewalk is, or like a safe crosswalk, and like the only way that you can identify to get into, let's say, like a store is, you think the easiest way would maybe be to like to cut through the grass. And when you cut through the grass, that could bring you to some safe place in a parking lot that's like, it's like enclosed, but and the only way that a car could like, it's a really long way though. This is kind of hard to explain, but then you basically like follow the grass around, which would eventually take you to not necessarily a designated crosswalk per se, but you know, it will bring you to this place that's it's like an island kind of, right? And you know, if you look for right, left, then right and left again, and then you feel safe crossing, then you go. Does that make sense?
It does. I think I know what you're saying, and I think it's possible. Not all of the places I see around here would give you that option, but I could imagine a scenario where, especially at a driveway exit or entrance into a shopping center, when you're trying to cross that, if you're trying to get to the building line, you might be able to kind of cut through some other space where cars can't drive.
Right.
And so I see what you're saying. It might not help you if your goal is to just cross that driveway and continue walking to the corner. If you need to make a turn, then that might work for you. So I think I know what you're talking about. And so, yeah, and what I would tell all my students is like, if you have figured out some method that's going to make you safer, that's fantastic. And because that's by far always our goal. And so I really appreciate that. Let me see here. So I will say that again, because I really want to drive this point home. And in fact, if this is the only thing you take from me today from this session, remember there is always an alternative to making an unsafe crossing. It's just not worth it. Okay, how do you use blocker cars? Okay, but one last thing. Let's talk about the color of your cane. What color are your canes? My guess is most of you probably have long white canes with a red tip. Maybe some of you have canes that are all white. Maybe some of you have purple ones or green ones or whatnot. What I will tell, one of the things I always tell everyone is that the perfect cane is the cane that you actually want to use. But I will tell you that research, as well as my own experience, shows that drivers are more likely to notice white canes. They're also more likely to yield to pedestrians using white canes. I think, and when I say white canes, I include white canes with a red tip. That is a very, very universally recognized symbol. Even around the world, that's a pretty well recognized symbol. Sometimes I think that when you have one of those like purple canes that Ambutech sells, they're cool. And trust me, I have a whole bunch of canes that are all sorts of colors. I don't know that drivers always recognize them for what they are. Here in Arizona, we have a lot of people who like to go hiking, and you see a lot of people that use trekker poles for when they go hiking. And a lot of those poles look a lot like the purple or green or blue canes that you can get on the market these days. So while I definitely want you to use a cane. Quite frankly, if you're not using a cane, if you don't have a cane, you probably shouldn't be out there trying to use blocker cars and make street crossings. And I would rather you use any cane versus no cane, but do remember that drivers tend to notice white canes better. And there's a growing body of research that backs that up. I read a very interesting article this week about putting lights on a cane. And there's some research that shows that by lighting up the cane, you might actually be making it less noticeable to drivers, which seems counterintuitive, but there's been some research about that. A lot of that comes from research about road workers and construction workers, and attempts to sort of light up their safety vests, and they found that when they did that, drivers paid even less attention to it. Doesn't make sense to me, but just remember that there's always a consequence or an action, a reaction to the things that you do. I could probably have quite a long discussion about colored canes and decorating canes. It's a presentation I give in some other venues pretty often, and I have a lot of just personal opinions about decorating canes, and I have decorated tons of them myself, and doing a variety of things. But white canes with a red tip are by far the most recognizable by drivers. So finally, how do you use blocker cars? And this is going to be where we start to talk about a little bit about the question we had about timing your crossing. So to begin with, it depends on your alignment. When you make any crossing at any street corner or a driveway, you are either aligned clockwise or counterclockwise. And I wanted to take a minute and talk a little bit about clockwise versus counterclockwise, because those are words that are based off of analog clocks, the idea of the hour hand and the minute hand and how they rotate around the face of a traditional clock. But I also know that not a lot of people use those clocks anymore. We all have cell phones and smartwatches and things of that nature to kind of tell us what they are, and everything seems to be digital. So and this is also a point where you get to, like, if you're in a good place where you can stand up, you get to stand up here for a second, because I want you to try and do a little exercise that we're going to do here. Now, I'm not going to stand up, because if you do, you're not going to see me anymore. But take a moment, stand up, make sure you're not going to smack your sister or your O&M teacher or whoever you're with. And I want you to take your left hand, put it straight out, and bring it in a big circle up over your head and touch your right shoulder. That's clockwise. That motion is clockwise. Okay. Now let's do it with your right hand. Put it straight out and bring it all the way up over your head. Touch your left shoulder. That's counterclockwise. And that's if you were looking at or using a traditional clock, that's the way that the hands of a clock move. In fact, if a clock is working, it never goes counterclockwise, but it always moves to the right. So when you're standing at street corners, it's the same thing. I'd like to tell people, if you were going to walk around this intersection and make 4 crossings and end up where you started, if you were making right turns around the intersection, you're going clockwise. And if you're making left turns around the intersection, you're going counterclockwise. The reason that matters with blocker cars is it determines where the blocker cars are coming from. And we've had a few questions and kind of discussion about that already today. So if you think about the picture I showed at the beginning or the video that I showed, both of those are alignment in a clockwise fashion. So if I was trying to go around, it would be to the right. Blocker cars at that point are coming from in front of you. They're still in your parallel lane, and they're on your right-hand side, but they're coming in front of you, and they're harder to detect. In fact, I think I've got that here. Yeah, I've got another picture here where we've talked about this. So they're coming in front of you, and then you can see we've got this, if you can see it, we've got this photo of, it's actually the same intersection as the very first photo I showed, but a different car. And we've got this kind of yellow box highlighting this black Toyota car that's right at the corner opposite of the one where I'm standing. And if this were video, you'd be able to see, you would see that car is moving straight through. But when your timing of your crossing needs to be right when that car is directly across from you, right at the opposite corner you're trying to get to. This takes a lot of practice. You'll have to stand out there and listen and identify those things over and over. One of the things I do with my students is we'll start out, and as the cars go by, I'll say that one, or now, as the blocker cars get to the correct position. So it helps my students localize that sound and determine, to know what to listen for when they're ready to go through. And then as they start to do it, I'll back away and I'll have them tell me when it is. And they'll say this one, or now. And that's a really good activity that you can practice with your O&M teacher as well. I'll tell you though, these can be harder to detect. just by nature, they are further away from you. And it just, so it's harder to localize it. And, you know, there are other competing sounds out there, and fewer of my students master this ability to do this in a clockwise fashion. Let's talk a little bit about counterclockwise. And this one I've actually got a video because it's hard to see in a still photo. But understand that when you're doing it counterclockwise, cars are coming from behind you, but they're also much closer. And when they get to the corner you're standing on, right as you hear them get to that and not turn or slow down, you can start to walk, because they prevent other cars from turning out onto the roadway, or left turning cars that are out there in the roadway turning in front of you to enter the side street or the driveway. And these are definitely easier to detect because they're right there where they're coming right next to where you're standing. And much more of my students master this skill and tend to kind of get better at it. I'm going to move this here and let's play this video. And in this video, what you're going to see is at the beginning is just the side street in front of me, which is perpendicular to me. My parallel street is on my left. There's a car that's across the street and driving away from me. That one's not very relevant, but what you are going to first hear then see are the sound of some cars coming up from behind me on my left. And as they drive by, I think there's 2 or 3 of them that drive by and kind of come up from behind and make their crossings. Let's play that here. There's 1, 2. In fact, if you can see in this video, the last car that goes by, it crosses the street and then it actually turns into one of those slip lanes I was talking about earlier, where there's a lane designed specifically for cars that are trying to enter a shopping center. I'm going to play that again, and I want you to listen to the sounds and kind of watch as the cars go by. And right as they get to where I'm standing, which is right at the moment that they sort of appear off the left edge of the video, that's when you would time your crossing. You can step into the street and start to cross, because they are, of course, they're going to make it to the other side of the street faster than you can. But what's most important is that you both have sort of started that crossing at the same time, and it prevents those cars that might be to your right from turning out and the other cars from turning out on the road into the street. So let's play that another time or two because it's really quick. 1, 2. And like I said, this is one of those skills that I want you to continuously practice, but as you do it, it'll become more and more second nature, especially in this counterclockwise way. Those are easier to detect. Some of my students like to turn and kind of look back and watch to see if those cars are coming. And sometimes my students, even if they can't see them coming from behind them, they can hear them a little bit better. And they'll make their crossing as they get to the corner you're standing on. My one point of caution on that is that sometimes when you're getting ready to cross the street, if you move your head too much, it can really contribute to veering. People tend to follow their noses, and I always tell people, keep your nose and your toes pointed in the same direction. And so if you're turning and moving, you might also be moving your feet a little bit, which can make it where you start to veer out into your parallel street or into your perpendicular street. So use caution if you do that. And I think we have actually that same video here, just a little bit larger. So let's play it another time. 1, right there. You'll hear, one of the things I always notice when I listen to the sound of traffic as it's approaching up to me, car tires make a very sort of constant sound if they're moving at a steady pace. And as they get further away, that constant drum just gets louder, 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 louder. But you don't hear that sort of squeakiness that sometimes you'll hear from a car's brakes, or as wheels start to turn down, as a driver applies the brakes and they start to slow down, you're causing more friction on the road, and so you'll hear that sound. So let's play it one more time and listen carefully to that sound. I've heard it described sometimes as it will sound like the cars are entering the back of your head and exiting out the front of your head. So if that's helpful, you can think of it that way as well. And let me see what my, so the technique. So again, you approach and you align. Then you have that analyzation and timing that I've talked about before. And then, so what you do is you listen for traffic in the nearest parallel lane. When you clearly hear that the car is not slowing down or turning, time your crossing to begin as soon as the blocker car is at the corner where you are standing, if aligned counterclockwise, or at the corner you are crossing to, if aligned clockwise. And that's a lot. And if any of you want me to read that again or have questions about that, kind of put them there in the chat. And in fact, I'll read it again anyway, just because there is a lot to think about. This PowerPoint should be available to you as well, so you can use it as a study guide when you're talking with your teacher. Listen for traffic in the nearest parallel lane. When you clearly hear that the car is not slowing down or turning, time your crossing to begin as soon as the blocker car is at the corner where you are standing, if aligned counterclockwise, or at the corner you are crossing to, if aligned clockwise. And then if there are no questions, I want to kind of review a little bit more too, because we've talked about a lot today. And I want you to kind of have some things to take away from what we're doing from this session. So what color cane do drivers notice most? Anybody have some thoughts on that? I've got the answers there for you, but I'd love to hear.
Hold on, give 5 seconds for all of our answers. They're rolling on in. So white. I got one from Connor, got something from Susie. So it looks like everybody has remembered this.
Very nice. Where are blocker cars coming from when aligned clockwise?
Give a few more seconds. Our answers are still popping in. In fact, thank you, Riley, for already answering our question about what color are the cane. White. All right, now some new answers are coming in for where are blocker cars coming from when aligned clockwise. So Riley says the opposite corner. Susie says in front. Nicole says oncoming towards me.
Ooh, I love it. I love all those different versions, actually. That's a great way to think about it in all three of those. Those are great answers. And then clockwise, what do you all think?
We'll give a second for those answers to come through. And here they go, behind me. Cammie's also answering the question about the cane. She said white. Good job, Cammie. But again, where are they coming from when counterclockwise? Behind me, parallel from Nicole and Casey.
Yeah, they are definitely behind you. They're parallel in both alignments. Remember that, because parallel can be in front of you or behind you. It's just whatever's on that side of you. But yep, that's exactly right. They're coming from behind you. Most of the time, counterclockwise is an easier skill to master. In fact, when I teach this concept, we always start by doing counterclockwise first, because I want to kind of get the concept first. And then my last question is, this should be an easy one for all of you. When should you make an unsafe crossing?
And while we wait for that important answer to come through, thank you, Donnie, for already answering the question about the cane. He also said white. But now, very important question. Recap, when did you make that unsafe crossing? All right, here comes our answers from Susie. Don't ever. Riley says never. Connor says never. And Nicole and Casey say never. Take the alternative. Yes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And there's bonus points if any of you remember my little catchphrase for what I tell you if
what's that catchphrase he says? So while we wait for some of you to answer that one, thank you, Cammie and Donnie, who say never. And Nicole and Casey came in with, oh, Riley's got it too. Better late than dead. Well done, guys.
Very good. I really appreciate you guys kind of remembering those things.
And one more important one that I think is worth mentioning. Jay mentioned this And then Susie in the chat has also shared this. Keep your nose and your toes facing the same direction. Yes.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that too, because one of the things I notice a lot with my students is when I say toes, I mean all your toes. Because there's something about the way we stand sometimes that we have one foot pointed in a certain direction, and then maybe our other foot is maybe at a slightly angle to that. And it's really important when you're getting ready to cross that you're lined up and that your nose and your toes are there, and you're all kind of pointed in the same direction. It's very easy to turn your head and then turn your feet and not realize you did that. And then when you get to that execution of the crossing phase, you step off the curb and you're not lined up anymore. You're starting out by veering, which means you're going to veer more, and it's going to be harder to recover for it. So another phrase that sometimes I will tell people is freeze your feet, especially when I'm working with younger kids. I'll say, freeze your feet, don't move. And in fact, a lot of times my students have to struggle not to turn and look to me. And I have to tell them, don't worry about where I am. Don't turn and look to me. If you want to talk to me, just keep talking, I'll hear you. One of the very, very best ways to avoid veering when you make any kind of crossing is to be properly aligned at the beginning. If you are not aligned correctly at the start of your crossing, you're pretty much guaranteed to veer. Now, of course, you're going to have a whole bunch of strategies on what to do if you veer, and you'll work on that with your O&M teachers as well. And if you haven't done that, I encourage you to talk about strategies on what to do when you veer, not only into your parallel street, but also your perpendicular street. And those are exceptionally important skills that you need to learn and are all sort of part of that process that you use in order you get ready to do this blocker car technique. Like I said at the beginning, this is a pretty advanced technique. I hope that all of you have learned at least a little bit about it and will be able to start to practice it and eventually use it effectively on a daily basis. Do we have any questions? I know we only have a few more minutes here. I have put my contact info here. You are all absolutely welcome to email me or call me anytime you want. I may not answer immediately, but I definitely will respond. I love teaching O&M and talking about these concepts. So if you have questions, you are all welcome to reach out to me anytime you want.
So Jay, if you want to stop sharing, you can come back. We'll wait for a few minutes to see if anybody now has some questions. And you know what, Susie, I read your thing about toes and nose. And you know, what's so funny is I thought Jay mentioned that because Jay was one of the first people that taught me that phrase. So I just assumed that he had mentioned that and I missed it because I always use that one when we're out. We will wait and see if there's any other questions about crossing the streets, blocker cars. Connor's already asking if you're going to come back and teach more sessions.
I would love to, especially if you have topics that you want. Let Robin and let them know. I would love to talk about more. O&M is something that's really important to me. I love teaching it, and I'd be more than happy to teach anytime that you wish.
And Connor, I can already tell you that Jay will not only be doing more future sessions of the APH Virtual Excel Academy, he will continue to work with us in our program as he has been so generous with it. All right, Leanne, I don't know if I see any other questions, but this was great information that I know we will be putting on the website.
Definitely, Jay, thank you so much. This was fabulous. We only have one more day left during 2020 for the Virtual Excel Academy. Tomorrow is our last one, which is talking about your census, which you're welcome to join in. Otherwise, we will be back again. Oh, was it the 14th?
It is.
Remember, the 14th of January at a new time, 3 p.m. Eastern. So you got to do your own math depending on what time zone you're in. So 1 hour later than what you're used to. We will be here every Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday for you. I will work on sending the slides out once I receive them in our follow-up email when you also receive your certificate of attendance. Otherwise, thank you so much, Jay. It's been fabulous.
Thank you all very much.
I think Ken's got a question. I see a hand up from Ken and Susie. We answered your question. It'll be emailed out to you. But Ken, if you are there, go ahead and ask your question.
Thanks a lot, Robin. I had a question for Jay. Was wondering how successful you find using blocker cars with a guide dog is.
Oh, that's such a great question. I mean, we probably don't have a lot of time, but I actually think it works better. Guide dogs are super smart, and I think they just sort of pick up on what you're trying to teach the client. And I think that they start to realize, like, oh yeah, there it is. And I'm not certain. I think some of the dog guide schools actually teach this concept as well. But yeah, it tends to work a little bit better.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. We'll see you tomorrow. Or wait, Leanne. I'll see you, Leanne, tomorrow.
See
And
me
everybody
tomorrow.
who joins us.